Hello, and welcome to our module on suicide risk and autism. This module is divided into 6 sections: prevalence of suicide by population, gender considerations, intersectionality, family risk, resources, and references. Time points for each section are provided on the PDF version of this PowerPoint to improve the ease of navigation. Research shows that people with autism are at greater risk for suicide than people without autism. Within the general population, suicide is the 12th leading cause of death within the United States. While many people know about the increased risk of suicide for veterans, few people know about the increased risk of suicide for autistic people. For veterans, suicide is the second leading cause of death. Veterans are at 1.5 times more likely to die by suicide than are people from the general population. Suicide is the third leading cause of death within the autistic community. In fact, autistic people die by suicide at 3 times the rate of people within the general population. Suicide is clearly an urgent concern within the autistic community. The means through which people with autism use to end their lives differs from the means that people without autism use. Firearms are the most frequent means of suicide for people of the general population. Firearms are used in approximately 50% of all suicides completed by males and about almost a third of suicides completed by females within the general population. While autistic people are more likely to die by violent means, to use violent means than non-violent means to complete suicide, they are 3 times less likely to complete suicide with firearms than people in the general population. Suicide risk within the autistic community looks a little bit different than it does within the general community. Men in the general population are almost 4 times more likely to commit suicide than females of the general population. However, within the autistic community, males and females complete suicide at similar rates. Autistic females are at 3 times greater risk of death by suicide than females of the general population, and autistic males are at twice the risk of completing suicide than males of the general population. Other risk factors of increased suicide for autistic people include physical health problems, cognitive impairments, and mental health difficulties. Children with autism who are overweight are 5 times more likely to make suicidal statements and 4 times more likely to engage in deliberate self-harming behaviors and to attempt suicide than their non-obese peers. Children with autism who take medication report higher levels of suicidal thoughts, as do children who report higher levels of pain. Studies have found that verbal IQ is associated with higher rates of suicidal statements for autistic youth, while low IQ has been shown to be associated with higher levels of self-harming behaviors. Autistic individuals with comorbid mental health diagnoses such as ADHD, depression, anxiety, oppositional defiance disorder, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and conduct disorder are more likely to engage in self-harming behaviors, to make suicidal statements, and to die by suicide than those without such comorbid conditions. A large Swedish retrospective cohort study recently explored the additive impact of ADHD, autism, and intellectual disabilities on suicide risk. Included in this study were more than 43,000 individuals with neurodevelopmental disorders. They found that people with autism, without an intellectual disability, and without ADHD were 8 times more likely to have died by suicide than were members of the control group. And that autistic people without an intellectual disability but with ADHD were 13 times more likely to have died by suicide than control group participants. Girls with autism seem to face different risk factors than males with autism. Girls with autism exhibit higher rates of social masking than boys. This may be why teachers report fewer concerns for girls with autism than for boys with autism. Masking has been found to be associated with higher rates of suicide. Girls are less likely to be identified as autistic than their male counterparts. When they are identified, they receive diagnoses on average 2 years later than males. When they're diagnosed, they generally have higher comorbid and cognitive impairments than males at first diagnosis. Women with autism report greater conflicts between autistic characteristics and typical social roles for gender. Other factors that seem to be associated with higher suicidal ideation and or death by suicide for autistic folks are social communication difficulties, the experience of being bullied, sensory difficulties, cognitive rigidity, insistence on sameness, and ruminative thinking styles. Autistic people are more likely to be underemployed than their same-aged autistic peers. Autistic individuals with lower levels of adaptive skills engage in more self-harming behaviors and attempt suicide at higher rates than autistic individuals with higher levels of adaptive functioning. Autistic individuals are more likely to commit suicide when they have been diagnosed with autism at a later age. Intersectionality describes the ways in which many aspects of a person's identity, including race, gender, sexuality, and rural status, influence their life experiences and the trajectory of their development. People of color, women, LGBTQI+, and rural residents often have access to fewer resources and are more likely to be underdiagnosed for autism. The minority stress model suggests that the cumulative effect of multiple marginalized identities increases an individual's risk for maladaptive outcomes, including suicide. Autistic people who report higher rates of LGBTQ status than members of the general population. Individuals who identify as LGBTQ+, that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, or intersex, face increased risk of suicide across the United States. LGBTQ+ youth consider suicide 3 times more than their heteronormative peers. Suicide rates for American Indian and Alaskan Natives are the highest for all racial and ethnic groups within the United States. American Indian and Alaskan Native youth aged 15 to 25 die by suicide at rates of 27 per 100,000 people per year, which is significantly higher than their Caucasian peers who die at suicide at rates at 22 per 100,000 per year. Black and Hispanic children are 2 times more likely to die by suicide than their Caucasian and Asian peers. When it comes to suicide risk, location matters. People in rural areas are nearly twice as likely to die by suicide than people living in urban areas. Approximately 19 per 100,000 rural residents die by suicide in the United States each year. This is compared to 13 per 100,000 urban residents. The rate of death by suicide among rural youths aged 15 to 19 is 54% higher than that of their urban counterparts. This reflects an increase of 74% over the past 12 years for youths residing in rural regions of the United States. Men who live in rural areas are at greater risk of suicide than men who live in urban areas. The rate of suicide among men in rural areas is 30 per 100,000 per year, compared to 21 per 100,000 per year for men living in urban areas. Rural men aged 85 and older are at greater risk for death by suicide, with rates of 60 per 100,000 people per year. The rate of suicide among women in rural areas is much lower than among men in rural areas. However, the suicide rate for women living in rural areas is 7.3 per 100,000, which is significantly higher than that of women living in urban regions of the United States at 5.8 per 100,000 people per year. Family members of autistic folks are also at greater risk of suicidal ideation and death by suicide. Full siblings of autistic people are at greater risk for suicide, as are half-siblings and first cousins. Suicide risk is a major health crisis worldwide, and autistic people seem to be especially vulnerable to this risk. More research is needed to better understand the suicide risk related to intersectionality of multiple marginalized roles for autistic individuals. The following resources provide useful information and support related to suicide. We hope that you find this module useful, and we thank you for attending.